Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Steadfast, covering Lorcana videos each week. And before we get started, I have an exciting giveaway for you all today. To celebrate the end of Disney Lorcana's The First Chapter, I'll be giving away a full play set of my favorite cards from each ink color. So stay tuned until the end of the video to find out how you can enter the giveaway. And with that, let's get into it. Today's video will be a bit of a grand finale for the first set of Lorcana, as I discuss and showcase the top 10 meta decks of the first chapter. I'll be going through top decks from number 10 to number 1 and breaking down a bit of info about each. This top 10 list is based on a few things, mostly success at major tournament events and general agreement among top players. And of course, a splash of my hopefully informed opinion. I've been covering meta decks since August, and I've loved being a part of covering Lorcana and playing each of these decks throughout events and tournaments. But with Rise of the Floodborn at our doorstep, I wanted to make this video as a celebration of the first chapter. Lorcana has proven, at least in my opinion, to be a wonderfully designed card game, and I'm excited for the future. I hope this video is a great way to look back at Set 1 decks, but I also think it'll be a fantastic starting point for anyone wanting to dive into Rise of the Floodborn. Although there will undoubtedly be brand new decks, upgrading a Set 1 deck from this video will be a great and cost-effective way to dive into Set 2, especially if you already have cards from the first chapter. Alright, enough rambling, let's get into the top 10. Starting out at number 10, we have the Fishbone Ramp deck, or Bell Ramp deck. I've loved this deck ever since the very beginning of the first chapter. It was one of the first decks I built and played a ton of. Looking at the list now, it's stayed relatively the same throughout, and it's no wonder. The powerful Inkwell ramping combos provide a high ceiling of potential and the simple ability to outpace your opponent. The core combos of the deck work as such. A Fishbone Quill on turn 3 allows you to quickly ink your entire hand over the following turns, including uninkable cards that you don't need. After inking, slam or sing a whole new world, and you'll reset your hand while being ahead in ink. Now you're ready to rinse and repeat, or begin outvaluing your opponent with great removal characters like Tinkerbell Giant Fairy, or Hades Infernal Schemer. Belle, Strange But Special, is also a key component. She can help speed up your ramp starting at turn 4, or she can come in later to threaten to quest for a fat 5 lore. Paired with Aurora, she can quickly become a dangerous win condition. This deck is the kind that, if you're playing against it, you'll want to derail their plan if at all possible, because once the engine starts pumping with ramp, removal, whole new worlds, and terrifying bells on board, they can run away with the win very quickly. I really like Fire the Cannons in this list. They're especially helpful against Amber Steel whole new world lists. This helps stall their game plan out and lets you ink up all you need before whole new world hits from either player. Against Ruby Amethyst control, be sure to max out 4 beasts. It's one of your tougher matchups, and this can really help fight back. Overall, the list is pretty polished, but one change I like to make sometimes that's a bit unorthodox is running Musketeer Mickey over Robin Hood. This change is for you if you like the Belle win condition and want to protect her even further, but he's also great protection for the Maleficent and other characters. If you can get these 5 and 6 cost characters out, even just one turn earlier in 4 and 5, it can be devastating for any deck to deal with. Alright, that's the overview of the very fun Sapphire Steel Fishbone Ramp deck. If you have any specific questions about this or any upcoming deck, make sure to drop a comment. I'll go through and answer what I can. Next up, we have another Sapphire deck, this time paired with Amethyst. This blue, purple, or violet control deck has had a bit of a rise towards the end of the first chapter. I've seen it grow in popularity, seemingly in response to the Ruby Amethyst control decks. I think many players simply wanted to see a different control deck rise up, and although this isn't quite in the same caliber of Ruby Amethyst, it can certainly be oppressive to deal with, and overall it's just a super fun list to run. Compared to the previous Sapphire Steel list and its access to a whole new world, the Inkwell Ramp in Amethyst Sapphire is less combo-oriented and is instead more tempo-based. Aim to play Grammatala Storyteller on turn 2, and Detective Mickey on turn 3. Weave in Amethyst's famous card draw by singing Friends on the Other Side, or by ramping into an early Queen, Wicked and Vain. But ultimately, your goal here is to speed up to your heavy hitters. Ursula, Power Hungry, does a bit of everything when played down, really pressuring the opponent, and yet Elsa, Spirit of Winter, can follow her up, coming in and hitting even harder. As for different options, instead of Rafiki, Mysterious Sage, you could play 2 copies of One Jump Ahead for a bit faster ramp, but I prefer Rafiki as a bit of safety against aggro lists. You could also play a different 4-cost character, such as one of the Jafars or even Zeus, over Jetsam or Belle, but I like Jetsam Ursula's Spy as a tech into an evasive heavy meta, and Belle, Strange But Special, into Whole New World decks. You can play her early and begin inking quickly if it's clear they plan to reset hands. Finally, I'm a huge fan of adding 2 copies of Magic Mirror to this list, but with so many steel lists in the meta running 3 or 4 beasts, I've left it off in favor of gaining back 2 precious uninkable slots, which are used to fill out some of the early game's character curve. Next up, we have our Emerald and Amethyst Aggro deck, a fan favorite deck that's strong but also quite budget friendly. This deck rose in popularity due to its ability to outspeed and take down bigger lists, although it's not always the most consistent and struggles against steel in a best of 3. It's one of the most powerful decks in a best of 1 if your opponent isn't prepared for what's coming. This deck list takes Emerald and folds in a lot of card draw from Amethyst, with staples like Maleficent Sorceress and her all-time favorite song to sing, Friends on the Other Side. Other 3-cost characters such as Cheshire Cat, Not All There, and Jasper Common Crook are also important here, as they can sing Mother Knows Best as well as Friends on the Other Side to fuel the fire with card advantage or sticking power for quest threats. Rafiki is also here at 3 to fight back against opposing aggro decks. Amethyst also adds a few more annoying characters in the form of Olaf, Friendly Snowman, and Pascal, Rapunzel's companion. Olaf is a simple 1/3, but Pascal's ability to stay evasive can often mean he gets off 3 or 4 turns worth of questing before getting banished. Although weak to steel with only 1 willpower, he's considerably strong against decks like Ruby Amethyst, for example, that don't have the early character presence or low-cost actions to take him out. Overall, this is a difficult deck to place because of its weakness to steel, and yet its strength against everything else too slow to deal with it. But despite that contention, I highly recommend this deck to anyone who's newer to Lorcana. Emerald Amethyst is budget-friendly, it's fun to pilot, and the Ink Duo is a great foundation for adding upcoming new cards from Rise of the Floodborn. Next, we have one of my favorite decks of all time, Emerald Steel Aggro, or as I like to call it, Cusco Bodyguards. Out of all the decks in the format, this is one that always seems to have the best upset potential. By nature, any aggro list can upset in Lorcana, but with the Emerald and Steel inks as a duo, they have varied tools that can fight back against a lot of different decks all at once. Everyone's getting super hyped about this ink combo going into set 2, and for good reason, but I've found this deck to be quite formidable in the first chapter as well. As the name suggests, the core of this deck revolves around Cusco, Temperamental Emperor, as every successful aggro deck does. He comes in on turn 5, poised to quest away, and when comboed with Steel, you unlock a powerful follow-up turn 6 with Mickey Musketeer for the 7 willpower bodyguard. This alone blocks a Maui or other strong challenger, forcing a 2-for-1 challenge or removal action from Mickey before taking out Cusco himself. In addition, the list makes use of Hercules, True Hero, a rarely used steel card, but his 3-cost bodyguard is quite threatening when following up a turn 2 Flynn Rider. Of course, Herc can also be a secondary guard for Cusco, or follow up any of the questing characters, like Aladdin, Cheshire Cat, Mad Hatter, or Tinkerbell most helpful. Speaking of this Emerald Tinkerbell, this ink pairing allows her to be an additional shift target for everyone's favorite giant fairy. And finally, the deck adds in additional 6-cost threats like a Mother Gothel Selfish Manipulator. She could be quite annoying with her ability to lock down questing, especially if played behind a bodyguard. You could certainly swap her out for John Silver if you like him more. He seems to be the clear preference among players. And normally I'd agree, but I found Gothel to be quite good behind a bodyguard. And when you're playing Steel, you don't need the when played aspect of John Silver's Reckless as much, since you're already quite strong against aggro lists. Instead, I prefer the 6 willpower on Mother Gothel actually, as it defends against the likes of an opposing Giant Tink or Aladdin Heroic Outlaw. But stay tuned because I have a new mill deck brewing for Rise of the Floodborn that I can't wait to share. Alright, up next it's time to finish our trilogy of aggro decks with one of my favorite lists, Emerald Sapphire. I call it the Teal Tempo deck because of its ability to ramp up a bit with Sapphire into some super valuable characters on turns 5, 6, and 7. These cards coming out early can really put on the pressure and force out a response, otherwise you'll run away with that precious 20 lore. As before with Emerald, the deck includes a classic company of great aggro characters with Flynn Rider, Cheshire Cat, Tinkerbell, Cusco, and Mad Hatter. Add Sapphire to the mix and you get an additional 5-cost quester with Maleficent Uninvited, as well as the strong ward potential from Aurora, defending your questing characters from targeted action removal. Sapphire also adds Detective Mickey, a strong turn 3 play that lets you skip straight to 5 ink on the following turn to place down those strong characters. But the tempo curve doesn't stop there. For 6 ink, I particularly love Robin Hood Unrivaled Archer, as you'll likely draw off him at 6, seeing as you're likely to have a smaller hand than the opposing player at this point. Also at the 6 ink cost level, Robin Hood is joined by Genie on the Job and John Silver Alien Pilot. And if you need to go up to 7 for some removal, there's 2 copies of Hades Infernal Schemer to cap off the list. Overall, this deck is quite formidable against a lot of lists, especially other aggro decks. And although it does struggle early game against Steel, it has potential to outpace them for the win. In fact, this deck has snuck its way into several top 16s, top 8s, and better throughout the last month or so, as players have used it to adapt and respond to more mainline decks. This is another list along with Emerald Steel and Emerald Amethyst that's slated to get some massive upgrades in Set 2, so hold on to this deck if you have it, and expect to see some major upgrades coming through. Up next, we take quite the leap up into the top 5 with the familiar list, the wonderfully consistent Amber Steel Midrange deck. Specifically, this deck was developed and popularized by Ducky, and it's full of songs and beefy characters. The deck's consistency comes from a few key areas, the first being an extremely low uninkable ratio, only 7 or 8 cards depending on how many Hades you run. Couple that with the ability to scout songs with Ariel, Spectacular Singer, and you can nearly always find a good card for ink. Obviously, Ariel is often scouting out and then singing Grab Your Swords as a major damage tool, but finding Hakuna Matata or Be Our Guest also feels nice as they fuel your inkwell. Or in the case of Be Our Guest, it can lead to finding impactful characters like Rapunzel or Surfer Stitch. As with many Steel lists, opening with Hook, Forceful Duelist, and Prince Eric feels efficient, as they threaten to challenge up on the opponent's curve. And Beast's item destruction allows the deck to fight back against Ruby Amethyst control decks and other Amber decks that like to spam lanterns. Another card specialized for the control matchup is LeFou Bumbler. His early questing is more than enough pressure to force a response from an early 2-strength character like Maleficent Sorcerer. This allows for a take back with Ariel or Small Tink, setting up a 2-damage heal and draw from Rapunzel. Finding opportunities like that to get ahead through Rapunzel or Surfer Stitch is the main path towards victory for many Amber lists, and this deck is no exception. My list here has a few small tweaks of its own. I really like running 2 copies of Kronk. His 6 strength in particular is able to take down a lot of popular characters with 6 willpower, such as Elsa Spirit of Winter and Maleficent Uninvited. Meanwhile, he can survive against Aladdin Heroic Outlaw or a rival Giant Tink. But other than that and the addition of LeFou, this list is quite similar to when I covered it with Ducky a while back. Our discussion around the strengths and core ideas still stands strong, so go check that out if you haven't. Next up, we have Amber Ruby Midrange. I'm calling it Orange Soda today, but it goes by many names. And let me start by saying, out of all the decks on this list, this will probably be the most controversial in terms of its placement, especially placing it up at number 4 above other great decks. So I'll admit to a little bias, this deck was my brainchild and my favorite to play out of any deck in the first chapter. That's not to say it isn't great or deserving of a top spot, but I think if anyone wanted to swap my top 10 list around a bit, this might be where they look first. So with that in mind, I do place it respectfully in the top 4 by a small margin. Overall, I think this is a really solid mid-range deck that combines great card draw and character value from Amber with the raw power of Ruby. It can be compared to an Amber Sapphire mid-range list, with the pseudo ink ramp instead coming from Lantern, which is key in this deck. Lantern allows for a turn 3 Ariel on human legs, which is an underwhelming card normally. But on turn 3, she threatens a next turn challenge into anything with 3 or less strength, ready for a juicy heal with the efficient turn 4 Rapunzel. Normally this role would fall to Smee or even better Cinderella, but without any singable 5-cost Ruby songs, Ariel comes in as the stronger of the 2 princesses in this list specifically. But she's not the only heal target for Rapunzel. The combo of Amber and Ruby allows for Maui to receive heals, plus he can join the battle on turn 4 with a lantern out. The mid to late game really opens up potential for creative lines using Hades, Lord of the Underworld. Beyond a typical Hades loop, which is always fantastic after a board wipe, breaking the loop to return Maui, Rapunzel, or Maleficent Monstrous Dragon to your hand will quickly become a bread and butter move in the late game that can take over even against many control matchups. In contrast, this deck also has to vitally cover the early game as its primary weakness. LeFou Instigator is here as a response to early bodyguards, or to double down with Aladdin later on. He, as well as the Amber LeFou, are joined by Gaston, who's here to also take out bodyguard Simba, as well as bigger threats such as Mad Hatter, Cusco, and Belle. Rockstar Stitch joins them as a flexible tool for either card draw or questing as needed. Although this deck can stumble against fast aggro lists, Amber Ruby's strength is its sticking power against the top 3 decks in the format. This is one reason I've enjoyed running the deck in competitive events where those top 3 decks are running wild. I encourage anyone curious to check out the list if you haven't. Go see my full video breakdown that includes some great gameplay. Next up, we have another fantastic midrange Amber list, Amber Sapphire Midrange. Strong Amber units are paired with the ramp strength of Sapphire, just like we've seen in other decks. But this time, these particular colors meld together in a package that really feels like more than the sum of its parts. I call this the Sapphire Surfer deck because, as with many of these mid to late game Amber lists, Surfer Stitch can completely take over a game with his win played ability, coupled with his enormous stat line. But of course, he's only one piece of the puzzle. This list has solidified itself as a clear top 3 deck with its ability to deal with any threat it faces turn after turn after turn. In the early game, beyond the typical ramp with Grandma Tala and Detective Mickey, Phil comes in as an early answer to Simba's and more, with his support ability throwing 3 strength onto unassuming characters like that Grandma Tala and Mickey. A few turns in, Rapunzel can begin healing up from those skirmishes, or Maleficent can come through and pressure the race towards 20. Again, as with the previous Amber Ruby list, 4 copies of Hades, Lord of the Underworld, are here for their powerful character recursion. They can loop themselves after a board wipe, or snag something valuable such as a bigger, bluer Hades with Hades' Infernal Schemer. He can be a devastating force to deal with after 7 ink, immediately answering opposing pressure, and Let It Go is his song equivalent that also puts in work throughout the game, especially when your board presence allows it to be sung efficiently. Finally, Belle, Strange But Special, makes another appearance. To repeat what I've mentioned before, as it still applies strongly here, she's a major questing threat, and she's a great tech choice against whole new world decks, helping you ink out your hand quickly before it's played. Overall, this deck is simply extremely effective. It's one of the only decks on this list that has proven it can consistently give the top 2 some trouble. That being said though, I think everyone agrees the top 2 decks in the first chapter are in an elite league of their own, and I think it's time we dive in and check them out. Let's get into the number 2 spot. Here it is. In my opinion, the second best deck in the format is the Hyper Control deck that we all know and only some of us love, Ruby Amethyst Control. Real quick, my list here is called Control 1660, simply identifying the deck by its uninkable ratio, 16 uninkables to 60 total cards. So let's discuss the obvious right away. Is this no longer the best deck? I and many others had it ranked at number 1 for so long. It was the reigning king during the majority of the first chapter, and to many it still is. I've had it at the top of all my video lists forever, since the very beginning of Lorcana's first chapter, and my first Lorcana video ever. And yet I have to say, I do think we've finally seen Control dethroned. But it's not as dramatic of a fall as that sounds. The competition between number 1 and number 2 sits fiercely on a nice edge, as we've seen in every top event. But before we get into the number 1 and how it can tackle Control, let's go over this list here because it's worth understanding and celebrating as an absolute dominant force in Lorcana. Ruby Amethyst Control has so many answers to almost every deck's game plan, especially in the late game. If you find yourself on turn 8 or 9 against this Control deck, and they still have several cards in hand, you're in for a world of trouble. My particular list here is extremely polished, and out of every deck, this is the one that's been the most workshopped and tweaked by the entire community and almost every top player. This is mainly due to its attempt to stay on top no matter what gets thrown its way. And after all the dust settling, I think we're left with a really strong deck where every single one of the 60 cards is included for a reason. Starting off with the deck's core concept, this Control deck combines the pure Ruby removal of Dragonfire, Be Prepared, and Maleficent Monstrous Dragon with the utility of Amethyst, including the insane stall potential of Elsa, Spirit of Winter. Even on her own, her potential to lock down a board for an entire turn is insane. But when combined with White Rabbit's Pocket Watch to rush in characters, or Aladdin, Heroic Outlaw to swing lore back in your favor, the 2 ink colors just complement each other so well. And among all this flashiness is a vital card draw package, anti-evasive tools, and a powerful broom combo consisting of Mickey Wayward Sorcerer, Befuddle, and the magic brooms themselves. In addition to their obvious effect of bringing Elsa, Maleficent Dragon, and fellow brooms back into your deck, proper broom loops created between Befuddles and Magic Broom allow for an infinite refill of the deck. True mastery of Ruby Amethyst Control is understanding the value of a near-empty deck, filled with exactly the tools you've chosen through broom returns. So with all of that, why isn't this deck still the clear number 1? Well, if you're playing digitally or without any time limit, I think this deck likely still takes the crown. But in a competitive standpoint, in a 50-minute best of 3, Control begins to show weaknesses within those constraints. The majority of matches involving Ruby Amethyst takes the majority of that time, and even without playing in a mirror matchup, this leads to an increased reliance on winning the first game as if it was a best of 1. And even then, overall game results often lead to a draw on the match record. The result is a deck whose potential is incredibly high, but in practice, its stalling playstyle can bog down your match record with draws and make it nearly impossible to complete a best of 3, especially one in your favor. Now, I don't want to end here too negatively at all, though. This deck is a true testament to the impressive design space given to Lorcana, even in its inaugural collection of cards. It's also a testament to player creativity, innovation, and resilience. I look forward to more decks with the same depth, nuance, and skill expression in Rise of the Floodborn. And here it is, the number 1 deck of Disney Lorcana, the first chapter. This is the Amber Steel Whole New World deck. In this deck list, we again see the formidable Amber units coupled with the defensive capabilities of Steel. But really, the stars begin to align when the power of a Whole New World is paired with the insane combo potential of Stitch Rockstar. I have to admit, I'm proud and surprised by my foresight. Back in August, on the week leading up to Lorcana's launch, I listed an Amber Steel list with a Whole New World as a top deck, placing it as one of 4 decks in S tier, 3 of which remain the top 3 today. And we'll just ignore the 4th being Lemon Lime Aggro. Actually, you know what? Scratch that. It's still S tier in my heart, at least. But even back then, my S tier list showed a Whole New World focused deck with the same major pieces, and I called it Steel Song. Of course, I did have Lilo and the Small Tinkerbell, which the deck has grown past. But even then, I suppose I realized the impact of Hades and Beast and other great cards. However, the community didn't quite grasp the power of Surfer Stitch just yet. Nowadays, the list has been refined and polished into an efficient machine, with options against every deck in the format. On turn 1, Stitch New Dog or Hook Forceful Duelist come in, so long as you have their Floodborn counterparts. They can also jump in for free on turn 2 along with Lantern, a key component to speeding up the early lines. If shifted in on turn 3, Happy Hook is your most efficient opener. You can even play out Lantern on both turn 2 and 3 and still get him out on a shift. That's great because your goal is to sing a whole new world with him, refreshing your hand with 7 cards, ready for turn 4 and beyond with a Lantern or 2 already ready to go. Rockstar Stitch is your other primary option as a combo opener. He comes in 1 turn later than Hook but unlocks card draw through small units that can either take over the early game or quickly refill the board in the late game. As another opening option, Ariel can come out on turn 3 to scout for a whole new world if not found in the mulligan. And sometimes instead you'll need to grab your sword if your opponent opens with some aggression. All of these are the key components of your deck, and if found, they set you up with a head start on board with a fresh hand right from the start. Now, Amber Steel does come with many variations, and although this is my recommended list, and one that's seen a lot of competitive success, let's go through a few great considerations. Although I'm a huge fan of the potential that Hades unlocks, you could swap him or the Floodborn Hook out to free up some inkable space. Some prefer Cinderella in this character slot as another Steel Song singer, but I've also really been liking 2 copies of Fire the Cannons. They're particularly great in the Steel Song Whole New World mirror match, as they allow you to take out an opposing Stitch or Hook early on. This means you now have the power to sing Whole New World at the best time for you, rather than allowing them to pull the trigger. This puts the early game into your own terms, which can make a big difference moving into the mid and late game. Finally, since this deck is at the top, narrowly edging out Ruby Amethyst, I wanted to briefly go over that specific matchup to solidify its position in the ranking. I'm asked about Amber Steel versus Ruby Amethyst more than any other matchup, so let's go through a few reasons why this Steel Song David can take down the Control Goliath. First, one of the obvious advantages is Beast Hardheaded and his item removal capability. Because of him, all Steel decks are quite the thorn in the side for Control. His item destruction is the main function in this particular matchup, but his ability to quest for 2 lore and sing both Whole New World and Grab Your Sword also contributes to his value in the deck. What makes him extra dangerous in Amber is you can loop him back with Hades if absolutely necessary. This isn't very common in practice at all, but it is one reason I give myself some wiggle room to run 3 Beast instead of 4 in the list. Without Hades, I'd consider maxing him out at 4, at least in this final meta we've seen in the first chapter, as he does also help destroy lanterns in the mirror match. The next strength of Steel Song into Control is a Whole New World, A timely play can clear out a full hand of Ruby Amethyst's vital tools. This is one reason why singing A Whole New World super early isn't as necessary against control, so taking the time to establish multiple characters and waiting for the whole new world until your hand is otherwise empty is quite effective. At this point, they'll begin gearing up for a Be Prepared board wipe, so it's a good time to refresh both players' hands. And that brings us to the next point. A pre-board wipe Surfer Stitch is very strong and easy to get off against control. With Lantern, you'll guarantee a Surfer before Be Prepared, even if you're on the draw playing second. He joins the fray, drawing 2 cards and forcing the Be Prepared, or at very least, the threat of him coming in for the draw can often force out a Dragonfire, even before turn 7. Regardless, the goal here is to be up in cards going into turn 7, 8, and so forth, and that can certainly be achieved through all of the above tactics we just mentioned. But finally, since Be Prepared is inevitable after all, how can we respond? If you know it's coming, you can have a plan for the rebuild. And one of the best ways to refill your board is with your Rockstar Stitch and his loyal fans. This continues your card advantage while putting out multiple units, such as Bodyguard Simba. He can thwart a Maui taking out a more valuable quester, just be careful of Maui utilizing Shield of Virtue to hit twice. But despite that, this wide pressure demands another Dragonfire for your Rockstar or another Be Prepared for the whole board. And so the cycle continues, hopefully with you in control of the ship. Now all this has been a picture of the ideal sequence, but these concepts are key examples of how this Amber Steel deck can pressure control and take over the game, and we've seen this at each event where these decks face off. So with all that said, I'll wrap up with Steel Song Whole New World as my #1 deck of Disney Lorcana's The First Chapter. And now I have to say thanks for watching this far. I know it's quite the slog watching through the entire top 10. Hopefully I kept you entertained. And real quick, as I mentioned at the beginning, I have a nice giveaway to celebrate this transition from the first chapter to Rise of the Floodborn. I'll be giving away a full playset of my favorite cards from each ink color. Each of these cards, except maybe Grab Your Sword, really changes the way the game is played through some really fun tricks, and I love that about all of them. But anyways, if you want to enter the giveaway, all you have to do is be subscribed to this channel here on YouTube, like this video, and comment below letting me know what your favorite card from the first chapter is. If you want, you can even join me and list your favorite card from each ink color. And it's not a requirement, but if you want to support the channel more, feel free to go follow me on Twitter and retweet my post about the giveaway to spread the word. I'll be randomly choosing and announcing the giveaway winner in about a week, and I'll reach out and ship out all the cards then. And with that, thanks again for watching the video. I'm excited to dive into detailed Rise of the Floodborn coverage soon, including top cards and top decks. So I'll see you then. Peace.